She's got nobody, Your Honor. Look at her. She's a pathetic, penniless stray I made the mistake of feeding." Frank's laughter echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom, sharp and cruel. Cecilia trembled, clutching her empty purse, eyes fixed on the floor as the gallery whispered. But Frank didn't see the shadow looming in the back of the room. He didn't see the storm coming. He thought he'd won the war before the first shot was fired. He was about to learn that silence isn't weakness, it's the loading of a gun. And the trigger? It was about to be pulled by a ghost from the past he never thought he'd see again. The fluorescent lights of the corridor outside courtroom 4B hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. But Frank Hall didn't mind. To him, it sounded like victory. He checked his reflection in the glass of a framed portrait of a long-dead judge. His Italian suit, a charcoal grey bespoke masterpiece that cost more than Cecilia's car, fit him like armor. He adjusted his silk tie, a smirk playing on his lips. Today was the day he cut the dead weight loose. He looked down the hallway. There she was, Cecilia Terry. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress that looked like it had seen better days, probably something she picked up at a thrift store after he cut off her access to the joint accounts 3 months ago. She looked small, defeated, exactly how he wanted her. Frank walked over, the click of his expensive loafers echoing on the marble floor. He stopped right in front of her, casting a long shadow over her seated form. She didn't look up. "Still waiting for a miracle, Cece?" Frank asked, his voice dripping with faux pity. "Or did your legal team get stuck in traffic? Maybe their bus broke down?" Cecilia finally lifted her head. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were dark and rimmed with red, likely from sleepless nights. But her voice was steady. "Leave me alone, Frank." "I'm just trying to help," Frank chuckled, leaning in closer so only she could hear. "You know you can still sign the settlement. It's generous. $5,000 and the old sedan. It's more than you deserve after dragging me down for 10 years. "I built that company with you," Cecilia whispered, the hurt flashing across her face before she could mask it. "I worked double shifts at the diner to pay for your supplies. I did the books at night while you slept." "You did data entry," Frank corrected sharply, his face hardening. "I was the visionary. I was the talent. And now that Hall Architectures is worth millions, you think you're entitled to half. You're delusional." He straightened up, checking his Rolex. "Mr. Sterling is going to eat you alive in there, Cecilia. He charges $1,000 an hour. Who do you have? God?" "I have the truth," she said. Frank laughed, a loud barking sound that drew glances from a passing clerk. "The truth doesn't work in court, sweetheart. Paperwork does. Lawyers do. Money does. And you have none of those things." Just then, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open. A bailiff stuck his head out. "Case number 4920, Hall versus Hall. All parties present?" Frank's lawyer, Marcus Sterling, rounded the corner at that exact moment. Sterling was a shark in a human suit, slicked back silver hair, a predatory smile, and a briefcase that smelled of rich leather. He didn't even look at Cecilia. He shook Frank's hand vigorously. "Ready to wrap this up, Frank?" Sterling asked. "I have a tea time at 3. "Let's get it over with," Frank grinned. He glanced back at his wife one last time. "Last chance, Cecilia. Walk away now, and I won't ask the judge to make you pay my legal fees." Cecilia stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles of her dress. She didn't look at him. She walked past him, her head high, though Frank noticed her hands were shaking. They filed into the courtroom. It was freezing inside, the air conditioning blasting. The Honourable Judge Halloway sat high on the bench, a woman known for her no-nonsense attitude and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Frank took his seat at the plaintiff's table, Sterling spreading out mountains of files, binders, and evidence logs. It looked impressive. It looked like a fortress. On the other side of the aisle, Cecilia sat alone. Her table was completely empty, save for a single, battered manila envelope. Case 4920, Judge Halloway announced, peering over her spectacles. Petition for divorce and division of assets. Petitioner Frank Hall is present and represented by Mr. Marcus Sterling. Respondent Cecilia Hall is present. The judge paused, her gaze lingering on the empty chair next to Cecilia. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Frank leaned back, crossing his legs, enjoying the show. Mrs. Hall, Judge Halloway said, her voice echoing slightly. I do not see counsel record for you. Are you expecting someone? Frank let out a short, derisive snort, quickly covering it with a cough when the judge glanced his way. Cecilia stood up slowly. She looked terrified. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I was unable to retain counsel. The accounts were frozen and... Objection, Sterling cut in smoothly, not even standing up fully. Mr. Hall froze the corporate accounts to prevent embezzlement. Mrs. Hall had access to her personal funds. There was $40 in there, Cecilia's voice cracked. Mrs. Hall, the judge warned gently, address the bench, not the opposing counsel. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Cecilia took a breath. I am representing myself. Frank covered his mouth to hide his grin. This was going to be a slaughter. He leaned over to Sterling. Watch this. She's going to cry in 5 minutes. I advise against self-representation in a case involving assets of this magnitude, Judge Halloway said, frowning. Mr. Sterling is a formidable opponent. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed alone? Cecilia looked at the empty seat beside her. For a second, she looked like she might bolt for the door. She looked back at the gallery, empty, save for a few bored law students. No friends, no family. Frank had isolated her from everyone over the years, convincing her that they were all jealous of their success. I have no choice, Your Honor, Cecilia said softly. Very well, the judge sighed, opening the file. Mr. Sterling, you may begin your opening statement. Frank felt a surge of adrenaline. It was starting, the dismantling of Cecilia Terry. He was going to strip her of everything, her dignity, her claim to his money, her pride. He was going to make sure she regretted the day she ever asked him for more respect. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. We intend to prove that Mrs. Hall contributed nothing to the valuation of Hall Architectures, that she has been a financial drain on my client, and that her claims of partnership are nothing more than the fantasies of a scorned housewife. Frank smirked at Cecilia. Go on, he thought. Break. But Cecilia wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the judge. She had turned her head slightly, listening to a sound coming from the back of the courtroom. The heavy double doors at the rear groaned. Thud. Thud. It was the sound of a cane hitting the floor, heavy, rhythmic, determined. Frank frowned and turned around. Sterling paused in mid-sentence. The doors swung open wide, hitting the back wall with a loud bang that made the bailiff jump. Framed in the doorway stood a figure that made Frank's blood run cold. It wasn't a lawyer. It was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, being pushed by a large man in a chauffeur's uniform. But she didn't look frail. She wore a wide-brimmed black hat, dark sunglasses, and a coat made of white fur that looked like it cost more than Frank's entire house. She lifted a gloved hand and removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were the exact same shade of hazel as Cecilia's, but harder. Much, much harder. "I apologize for the tardiness, Your Honor." The old woman's voice rang out, clear and sharp as a diamond cutter. "Traffic from the airport was a nightmare, but I believe my daughter needs a better seat." Frank's mouth fell open. He grabbed Sterling's arm. That's impossible," he stammered. "She's dead. Cecilia said she was dead." "Order!" Judge Holloway banged her gavel, the sharp sound cracking through the stunned silence of the courtroom. "There will be order in my court." Frank couldn't take his eyes off the woman in the wheelchair. His brain was misfiring, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the story he'd been told a decade ago. Cecilia's mother was a drunk, he thought frantically. She died in a flophouse in Reno. Cecilia cried for a week. We didn't go to the funeral because I told her flights were too expensive. There was no funeral. "Frank," Sterling whispered urgently, leaning in. "Who is that? Why does she look like she owns the building?" "I don't know," Frank hissed back, sweat beginning to prickle along his hairline, despite the freezing air conditioning. "She's supposed to be dead." The elderly woman ignored the judge's gavel. She signaled her chauffeur with a flick of her wrist. The large man maneuvered the wheelchair effortlessly down the center aisle, parking it directly next to Cecilia's empty table. Cecilia looked down at the woman, tears welling in her eyes. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." "I told you I would," the woman said, her voice dropping an octave, softening just for a moment. Then she turned her gaze back to Frank. The softness evaporated instantly. "Though I admit, I almost turned the car around when I saw who you married. He's even shorter in person." Frank flushed a deep, angry crimson. "Now see here. Identify yourself, madam," Judge Holloway commanded, leaning over the bench. "This is a closed session for divorce proceedings. Unless you are a party to this case, you must sit in the gallery." The woman adjusted her white fur coat, the diamonds on her fingers catching the fluorescent light. "I am Evelyn St. James, and I am not just a party to this case, Your Honor. I am the bank." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Even Judge Holloway blinked. Marcus Sterling stiffened beside Frank, his expensive pen pausing mid-air. "St. James," Sterling muttered, his face draining of color. "Frank, tell me she means a different St. James. Tell me your mother-in-law isn't the Evelyn St. James of St. James Real Estate." Frank stared at him blankly. "Who?" Sterling looked at Frank with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "The woman who owns half of Manhattan? The woman who buys skyscrapers for sport? You told me your wife was a nobody from nowhere." "She told me she was poor," Frank whisper shouted, panic rising in his chest like bile. He looked across the aisle. Cecilia was standing straighter now, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder. The resemblance was undeniable. The same jawline, the same eyes. "Mrs. Hall," Judge Holloway said, addressing Cecilia. "Is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor," Cecilia said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. I ran away from home when I was 20. I wanted to make it on my own. When I met Frank, I didn't want him to love me for my money. So I told him I didn't have any family. I told him my mother had passed away." She looked at Frank, her expression filled with a decade of suppressed pain. "I thought if we struggled together, built something together, it would be real. I thought you loved me." Frank felt the trap snap shut. He remembered all the times he'd belittled her for being lucky he rescued her from poverty. All the times he'd mocked her thriftiness. He had been sitting on a gold mine for 10 years and had been too arrogant to pick up a shovel. "Touching," Frank sneered, trying to regain control. He couldn't let them see he was rattled. "So you lied. Perjury before we even started. Good job, Cecilia. But it doesn't matter who Mommy is. The business is in my name. The prenup—" "There is no prenup," Sterling corrected quietly. Remember? You said she had nothing to protect, so why pay for the paperwork? Frank gritted his teeth. Whatever. It doesn't change the fact that she has no lawyer. It's too late to file for a continuance. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, the respondent has no counsel. Her mother cannot represent her unless she's a member of the bar. Evelyn St. James let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. Oh, you foolish little man. I didn't come here to argue the law. I'm retired. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a sleek, black leather folder. I came to deliver this, Evelyn said. She gestured to the courtroom doors again. And him. The doors opened for the second time. If Marcus Sterling was a shark, the man who walked in was the megalodon that ate sharks for a snack. He was tall, wearing a navy three-piece suit that screamed, Savile Row. He carried no briefcase, only a single thin tablet. He walked with a predator's grace, ignoring Frank completely. Sterling actually gasped. Oh no! Who is it? Frank demanded. Julian Thorne, Sterling whispered, closing his eyes as if in physical pain. They call him the Grim Reaper of contract law. Frank, he hasn't lost a case in 15 years. He represented the governor in his divorce. He charges $5,000 an hour. Julian Thorne stopped at the defense table. He bowed slightly to Cecilia, then to Evelyn. Finally, he turned to the judge. Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice smooth, baritone and commanding. Julian Thorne, entering an appearance for the respondent, Cecilia St. James Hall. My notice of appearance was filed electronically 3 minutes ago. He placed the tablet on the table and turned slowly to look at Frank. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly dismissive. And regarding the petitioner's claim that Mrs. Hall contributed nothing to the business, Thorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We have a motion to dismiss the petition and a countersuit for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Frank laughed nervously. Fraud? You're grasping at straws. Are we? Thorne tapped his tablet. The screen on the wall behind the judge flickered to life. Mr. Hall, do you recognize the initial seed money transfer for Hall Architectures dated 10 years ago? A bank statement appeared on the screen. That was a loan, Frank said quickly, from an anonymous investor. I paid it back. The investor was ESJ Holdings, Thorne corrected. Evelyn Street James Holdings. Your wife didn't just do the books, Mr. Hall. She funded your entire existence using a trust fund you didn't know existed. Technically, you don't own Hall Architectures. Thorne leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that echoed in the silent room. Technically, you're just the employee, and you're fired. Frank stared at the screen, the numbers blurring before his eyes. Fired? He choked out, his laugh sounding more like a dry heave. You can't fire me. I am the CEO. I am the founder. You are the manager, Thorne corrected, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel, and a poor one at that. Thorne swiped his finger across the tablet. The screen changed. It was a legal document, signed 10 years ago. Frank squinted at it. It was the incorporation paperwork for Hall Architectures. There, at the bottom, was his signature. But above it, in the fine print he had been too arrogant to read, was the name of the holding company. When you signed your initial funding agreement, Thorne explained, pacing slowly in front of the bench, you agreed to a silent partnership clause. The investor, Mrs. St. James, retained 51% controlling interest until the principal loan was repaid. Have you repaid the principal, Mr. Hall? I paid myself dividends, Frank spluttered, turning to Sterling for help. Marcus, do something! Tell them that's illegal! Marcus Sterling was currently busy trying to become invisible. He had closed his binders. He was no longer taking notes. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. "Frank," Sterling whispered, his voice tight. "Did you read the bylaws? The ones you told me were standard boilerplate and not to bill you for reviewing?" Frank's silence was deafening. "I see," Sterling said, closing his eyes. "Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to—" "Denied," Judge Halloway said, leaning forward. She was enjoying this. "I want to hear about this fraud." Thorne nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. You see, Mr. Hall believed he was a business prodigy. He believed his firm was turning a massive profit year over year. But the truth is—" Thorne paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at Cecilia. "Cecilia, would you like to tell him?" Cecilia stood up. She looked at Frank, not with anger, but with a pity that burned him worse than hatred. "We never made a profit, Frank. You spent too much. The Italian marble for the lobby, the company retreats to Aspen, the bespoke suits you charged to the expense account. We were in the red every single year." "Liar!" Frank screamed, slamming his hand on the table. "We were the top firm in the city." "Because I covered the losses," Evelyn St. James spoke up from her wheelchair, her voice dripping with disdain. "Every month, when you overspent, Cecilia would call me. She'd beg. 'Just a little more, Mama. He's stressed. He's trying so hard.' So I wired the difference. I kept your lights on, Frank. I paid for your ego." Frank felt the room spinning. His entire identity, the self-made man, the brilliant architect, the provider, was shattering. He wasn't a king. He was a charity case. A stray cat kept fed by the wife he called a leech. "You," Frank pointed a trembling finger at Cecilia, "you deceived me. You made me think I was successful. That's entrapment. That is love, you idiot," Thorne snapped, losing his cool demeanor for a split second. "She protected your fragile ego for a decade. And how did you repay her? By cutting off her credit cards and trying to leave her with a used sedan." Thorne turned back to the screen. "But incompetence isn't a crime, Mr. Hall. Embezzlement is." Frank froze. "I never stole. It's my company." "It's her company," Thorne corrected. "And 3 months ago, right before you filed for divorce, you made a withdrawal. $200,000 from the Emergency Capital Fund. You marked it as consulting fees for a vendor named Sapphire Interiors." Frank's face went white. Whatever color was left in his cheeks vanished instantly. Cecilia gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Frank, we don't use a vendor named Sapphire Interiors." It was a retainer," Frank stammered, sweat pouring down his face now. "For future projects, big projects." Thorne tapped the tablet again. A photo appeared on the screen. It wasn't an office. It wasn't a design studio. It was a luxury condominium complex in downtown. The receipt was for a down payment on Unit 402. "Sapphire Interiors isn't a vendor, Mr. Hall," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "It's a shell company registered to a residential address. And who lives at that address?" Thorne swiped again. A driver's license appeared on the screen. The woman in the photo was young, blonde, beautiful, and very, very familiar to everyone in the room. The gallery gasped. Even the judge's eyebrows shot up. It was Jessica Vance, the 22-year-old receptionist at Hall Architectures. The one Frank had sworn to Cecilia was just a kid he was mentoring. "You bought your mistress a condo with your wife's mother's money," Thorne said, clarifying the absurdity of the crime. "And you thought you wouldn't get caught because you assumed Cecilia was too stupid to check the books." Cecilia slowly sat down. She didn't cry. She just stared at Frank as if she were looking at a stranger. "Jessica," she whispered. "She came to our Christmas party. She ate my food. You told me she was like a daughter to you." Frank looked around the room. He saw the disgust on the judge's face, the horror on Sterling's, the cold fury in Evelyn's eyes. He had nowhere to run, so like a cornered rat, he decided to bite. Frank stood up, buttoning his jacket, trying to summon the arrogance that had carried him this far. "So what?" He spat, his voice shaking with rage. "So I wanted someone who actually appreciated me. You think money buys respect, Cecilia? You were a mouse, a boring, mousy little housewife who wore sweatpants and clipped coupons. Jessica treats me like a man. She knows my worth." He looked at Evelyn. "And you? You old witch. You think you can buy me? I'll fight this. I'll burn the whole company down before I let you take it." "Burn it down?" Evelyn asked calmly. She reached into her bag again. "You can't burn what you don't have, Frank," Evelyn said, pulling out a small silver thumb drive. She handed it to Thorne. Thorne plugged it into his tablet. "Frank, did you really think the 200,000 was the only thing we found?" "What is that?" Frank asked, his voice trembling. "We found the emails, Frank," Thorne said, looking at him with eyes that promised destruction. "The emails between you and the rival firm, Apex Designs. The ones where you were selling your own clients' blueprints to them for cash under the table." Sterling slammed his briefcase shut. He stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I move to withdraw as counsel immediately. I cannot represent a client who is actively committing corporate espionage." "Granted," Judge Holloway said instantly. Frank stood alone. No lawyer, no wife, no company. "You sold us out?" Cecilia asked, her voice breaking. "You sold our clients?" "I needed the money," Frank screamed. "To pay for the life you expected." "No," Evelyn said softly. "To pay for the life you felt entitled to." Thorne stepped closer to the microphone. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, we are not just asking for the divorce. We are asking for the immediate arrest of Mr. Frank Hall for grand larceny and corporate espionage. The police are waiting in the hallway." Frank's eyes bulged. He turned to the double doors. Through the small glass window, he saw the flash of blue uniforms. "Wait," Frank whimpered, the fight draining out of him instantly. "Wait, Cece. Baby. Please, don't let them take me. I can explain. We can fix this. I still love you." He reached out toward Cecilia across the aisle. Cecilia looked at his outstretched hand, the hand she had held for 10 years, the hand that had worn the ring she bought him. She slowly stood up, walked to the center of the aisle, and stood inches from him. "Frank?" she asked softly. "Yes, baby?" "Yes?" Frank's eyes lit up with pathetic hope. Cecilia leaned in close, so close he could smell her perfume. "You missed a spot shaving," she whispered. Then she turned her back on him and walked toward her mother. "Take him away," Judge Holloway ordered. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound Frank Hall had ever heard. It echoed in his ears, drowning out the murmurs of the courtroom as the bailiff recited his rights. "You have the right to remain silent." Frank didn't remain silent. "This is a mistake," he shouted, struggling as the bailiff shoved him toward the side exit. "Call the governor. I donated to his campaign. I demand my phone." "You can make a call from booking," the officer grunted, unimpressed by Frank's bespoke suit, which was now wrinkled and damp with sweat. They marched him out of the courtroom and into the main hallway of the courthouse. Frank expected a quiet exit out the back. He expected to be slipped into a car discreetly so he could fix this mess before the evening news. He was wrong. As the double doors swung open, a wall of flashbulbs blinded him. "Mr. Hall, is it true you embezzled millions?" "Frank, look this way. Did you sell out your clients?" "Mr. Hall, Comment on the affair with your receptionist." Frank blinked, dazed. Dozens of reporters were crammed into the hallway, microphones thrust over the velvet ropes. "How?" Frank stammered. "How do they know?" Behind him, Evelyn St. James rolled out of the courtroom, looking like a queen surveying her kingdom. She lowered her sunglasses. "I have a very efficient PR team, Frank. We live-streamed the hearing. You're trending on Twitter." Frank felt his knees buckle. The bailiff had to hold him up. He was being paraded. It wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a social execution. They dragged him toward the glass doors leading to the street. Through the glass, Frank saw a sleek red convertible parked in the loading zone. Jessica. His heart leapt. Jessica was here. She would stand by him. She was the one person who truly understood his genius. She would call her father, who was a lawyer. She would fix this. "Jessica!" Frank screamed as he was pushed through the doors into the humid afternoon heat. "Jess! Over here!" Jessica Vance was leaning against the red convertible, a car Frank had leased for her under the company name 2 weeks ago. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and checking her phone, looking bored. When she heard her name, she looked up. She saw Frank. She saw the handcuffs. She saw the police officers. The bored expression vanished, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Baby!" Frank yelled, fighting the officer's grip. "Call your dad. Tell him it's a setup. They're framing me." Jessica didn't move toward him. She took a step back. She looked at the cameras surrounding them, then at Frank's desperate, sweating face. "I don't know him," Jessica shrieked, shielding her face with her designer purse. "I'm just an employee. I was just waiting for an Uber." Frank stopped struggling. The air left his lungs. "What?" "I don't know anything about any fraud," Jessica yelled at a reporter who thrust a microphone in her face. "He told me he owned the company. He lied to me, too. I'm a victim." "A victim?" Cecilia's voice cut through the noise. Cecilia stepped out of the courthouse, flanked by Julian Thorne and 2 large security guards. She looked at Jessica with a calm, icy demeanor that was terrifyingly reminiscent of her mother. Jessica froze. "Cecilia, look, I didn't know. He told me you were separated. He said you were crazy." "Save it," Cecilia said, walking down the steps. She stopped right in front of Jessica. "I saw the texts, Jessica. The ones where you called me the dowdy old cow and asked Frank when he was going to put me out to pasture." The crowd went silent. The cameras zoomed in. Jessica stammered, looking for an exit. "I want my lawyer." "You're going to need one," Julian Thorne interjected smoothly. "Since you are the beneficiary of the embezzled funds, specifically the condo and this car, you are currently in possession of stolen property. That makes you an accessory to grand larceny." Jessica's eyes went wide. She looked at the red convertible. "Hand them over," Cecilia said, holding out her hand. "What?" Jessica asked. "The keys," Cecilia said, "and the key to the condo. Now, or the officers taking Frank can take you too." Jessica looked at the police, who were watching with interest. She looked at Frank, who was staring at her with the broken expression of a man realizing his goddess was just a gold digger. With a sob of frustration, Jessica dug into her purse and threw the keys at Cecilia's feet. "Fine, take them. He's broke anyway. I don't date broke losers." She turned and ran down the sidewalk, her high heels clicking frantically as she tried to escape the cameras. Frank watched her go. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for. The woman he had stolen for. She hadn't lasted 5 seconds. "She never loved you, Frank," Cecilia said quietly, picking up the keys. She looked at him, her eyes sad but dry. "She loved the lifestyle I paid for." The officer shoved Frank's head down. "Watch your head." "Cecilia!" Frank cried out as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser. "Cecilia, please, I'm sorry. I'll sign anything. Don't leave me here." Cecilia didn't answer. She turned to Julian Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, does this car have a heated seat?" "I believe it does, Mrs. Hall." Thorne smiled. "Good," Cecilia said, opening the door of the red convertible. "My mother hates the cold." As the police car pulled away, Frank looked out the window. He watched his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, help her mother into the passenger seat of the car he had bought for his mistress. He watched them drive away, leaving him alone in the cage of the police car, the siren wailing the song of his demise. But as the cruiser turned the corner, Frank's phone, which the officer had confiscated but left on the seat next to him, buzzed. A notification lit up the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "Don't get too comfortable in that cell, Frank. You owe us a lot of money for those blueprints. And we don't sue. We collect." Frank stared at the screen, and for the first time that day, the fear of prison was replaced by a much, much darker terror. While Frank Hall was being processed in a windowless room that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale fear, Cecilia Terry was stepping into the elevator of the Hall Architectures building. She wasn't wearing her usual beige cardigan. She had stopped at a boutique on the way over, using the black, emergency credit card her mother had pressed into her hand. Now, she wore a sharp, crimson blazer that looked like armor. Beside her, Evelyn St. James checked her makeup in the elevator mirror. "Remember, darling," Evelyn said, snapping her compact shut, "you aren't the wife visiting the husband's office. You are the landlord evicting a squatter." The elevator doors pinged open. The reception area was chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook. Staff members were huddled in frantic clusters, whispering, their eyes glued to the muted TV screen on the wall, which was currently replaying footage of Jessica Vance throwing the keys at Cecilia's feet. When Cecilia stepped out, the silence hit the room like a physical wave. Barry, the vice president of operations, a man who had once laughed when Frank joked about Cecilia's coupon clipping, froze. He was holding a shredder bin. "Mrs. Hall," Barry stammered, his face pale. We were just tidying up." "Put the bin down, Barry," Cecilia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the open-plan office. Barry dropped the bin. "Cecilia, listen. Frank told us to—" "It's Miss Terry," Cecilia corrected, walking past the empty reception desk where Jessica used to sit. She ran a finger along the marble counter, marble she had paid for. "And you're firing the wrong people, Barry." She turned to face the room. 20 employees stared back. Some looked guilty, others looked terrified. "I know who knew," Cecilia said, making eye contact with the senior partners. "I know who went to the business dinners that were actually parties on my dime. I know who covered for Frank when he was with Jessica. I know who helped him doctor the books." She pulled the tablet Julian Thorne had given her from her bag. "Barry," she said, "you signed off on the consulting fees for Sapphire Interiors. Pack your things. You have 5 minutes." "You can't do that," Barry spluttered, his face turning red. "I have tenure. I'm a partner." "You're a co-conspirator in a federal embezzlement case," Evelyn St. James said, rolling her wheelchair forward from the elevator. "And I'm the majority shareholder. If you're not out of the building in 5 minutes, security will remove you. And Barry, leave the shredder." Barry looked at the security guards flanking the women. He slumped, defeated, and began shoving photos into a box. Cecilia walked into Frank's office, the corner office with the panoramic view of the city. It was a shrine to his ego. Awards he hadn't earned on the shelves, a humidor of cigars he couldn't afford on the desk. She sat in his leather chair. It was too big for her, but for the first time, she felt like she fit. "Change the locks," Cecilia told the head of security. freeze all company cards, and get someone to scrape the name Hall off the glass doors. I want St. James and Terry up there by tomorrow. Across town, the accommodations were significantly less luxurious. Frank sat on a metal bench in a holding cell designed for 10 men, but currently holding 20. His bespoke Italian suit jacket had been taken as evidence, leaving him in his sweat-stained dress shirt. He was shivering. He had tried to make his phone call. He had called Marcus Sterling. The call went straight to voicemail. He had called his best friend, Dave. Number disconnected. He had called his mother. She had hung up after sobbing. I saw the news, Frank. How could you? Now he sat alone in the crowd, hugging his knees. You look like you lost a bet, rich boy, a voice rasped. Frank looked up. A man with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck was grinning at him from the other side of the bench. I'm just here for a misunderstanding, Frank whispered, shifting away. My lawyer is coming. Is he? The man laughed. 'Cause the guard said you're the guy who stole from his own wife. That's low, man. Even inside, that's low. Before Frank could respond, the heavy steel door buzzed. Hall! The guard shouted. Legal visit! Frank let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Sterling. He had come back. He must have seen the news and realized Frank was still his biggest client. Frank scrambled up and followed the guard to the visitation room. He sat behind the plexiglass, waiting for Sterling's silver hair and expensive suit. But the man who walked in wasn't Marcus Sterling. He was younger, wearing a suit that was sharp but cheap. He had a shark-like grin that didn't reach his eyes. He carried no briefcase. Who are you? Frank asked, his hand trembling on the receiver. I'm Mr. Vane, the man said smoothly. I represent Apex Designs. Frank's blood turned to ice. Apex Designs, the rival firm he had sold the blueprints to, the people who had sent the text message. I didn't tell them anything, Frank whispered hurriedly, glancing at the guard by the door. I swore I didn't. The police, they just guessed. Frank, Mr. Vane sighed, shaking his head. We aren't worried about what you told the police. We have people for that. We're worried about our investment. Vane leaned closer to the glass. The condensation from his breath fogged the surface. You sold us the schematics for the St. James Tower renovation, Vane said. We paid you $50,000 in cash, but now, since your wife has taken over, she's going to audit the files. She's going to see the missing data, and she's going to change the designs. I can't stop her, Frank pleaded. I'm in jail. Exactly, Vane said, his voice hardening. You're useless to us, Frank, and you're a liability. If you cut a deal with the DA, if you mention Apex to save your own skin. Vane didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He simply held up a piece of paper against the glass. It was a printout of a photo of Frank's elderly mother gardening in her front yard. Taken this morning. Don't get any ideas about cooperation, Vane whispered. You take the fall alone. You plead guilty. You keep our name out of your mouth, or the next visit you get won't be from a lawyer. Vane stood up, buttoned his jacket, and smiled. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Hall. I hear the food is terrible. He walked out, leaving Frank staring at the empty chair, the receiver dangling from his hand, swinging like a pendulum, counting down the seconds of his life. The visitation room at the county jail was stark, cold, and smelled of despair. Frank Hall sat at the metal table, his hand shaking uncontrollably. Every time the door buzzed, he flinched, expecting Mr. Vane to return with another photo, or worse, a photo of his mother hurt. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. The reality of his life had collapsed into a singularity of terror. He was trapped between a federal indictment and a criminal syndicate. The door buzzed. Frank squeezed his eyes shut. I told you, he whimpered. I'm not talking. I plead guilty. Just leave her alone. Open your eyes, Frank. The voice wasn't Vane's smooth, predatory rasp. It was cool, composed, and familiar. Frank snapped his eyes open. Cecilia sat across from him. But this wasn't the Cecilia who used to bring him coffee in bed. This wasn't the woman who clipped coupons. She wore the crimson blazer he had seen on the news, and her hands were folded neatly on the table next to a digital recorder. "Cecilia?" Frank breathed, hope surging through him like a drug. "Oh, thank God! Cece, you have to get me out. They're going to kill me. They're going to hurt Mum." "I know," Cecilia said calmly. Frank froze. You know?" "Mr. Vane from Apex Designs," Cecilia said, reciting the name as if reading a grocery list. "Real name, Victor Cray. He visited you 3 hours ago. He threatened your mother to ensure your silence regarding the St. James Tower schematics." Frank's jaw dropped. How do you know that?" "Because unlike you, Frank, I don't hire incompetence," Cecilia said. She nodded toward the two-way mirror. "Julian Thorne had a private investigator on you the moment the handcuffs went on. We have audio of Vane's threat. The police are picking him up now." Frank slumped back in his chair, relief washing over him so hard he felt dizzy. "They got him? So Mum is safe?" "Your mother is currently at my estate," Cecilia said, her voice devoid of warmth. "My security team picked her up an hour ago. She's drinking tea with my mother. She's safe, Frank. No thanks to you." Frank wiped tears from his face with his dirty sleeve. "Thank you. I knew you still cared. I knew you wouldn't let them hurt her. Cece, I can fix this. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything about Apex. If I cooperate, maybe I can get probation. We can start over." He reached for her hand across the table. Cecilia pulled her hand back, as if he were radioactive. "Start over?" She looked at him with genuine bewilderment. "Frank, you don't seem to understand the gravity of what you did." She placed a glossy photograph on the table. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a simulation rendering of a skyscraper. The St. James Tower. It showed the building collapsing in a cloud of dust. "We cracked your laptop, Frank," Cecilia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We found the files you sent to Apex. You didn't just sell them the design. You sold them the engineering specs." "So?" Frank stammered. "It's just data." "You gave them access to the structural load-bearing calculations," Cecilia said, her eyes flashing with fury. "And we found the modifications Apex made. They weren't going to build a copy, Frank. They were using your backdoor access to alter the data in our system. They were trying to sabotage the construction. If we had built the tower using the corrupted files you let them upload, it would have collapsed. Hundreds of people would have died." The room went silent. Frank stared at the photo of the collapsing tower. I didn't know," he whispered. "I just thought they wanted to outbid us. I didn't know they were going to hurt anyone." "You didn't care," Cecilia corrected. "You wanted money for a condo and a mistress. You risked hundreds of lives for a red convertible." She stood up, towering over him. "I'm not here to save you, Frank," she said. "I'm here to offer you a choice. The district attorney is prepared to charge you with corporate espionage, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism because of the sabotage." Frank began to hyperventilate. "Terrorism? No, please." "Or," Cecilia continued, "you sign this." She slid a document across the table. "What is it?" Frank asked, his vision blurry. "A full confession," Cecilia said. "You admit to everything. You name Victor Cray and the CEO of Apex as your co-conspirators. You give us the encryption keys to their secure server, the one you access to upload the files. You help us bury Apex Designs." "If I do that?" Frank looked up, his lip trembling. Will you take me back?" Cecilia laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. "No, Frank, but if you do this, Julian will talk to the DA. He'll get the terrorism charges dropped. You'll go to prison for fraud, maybe 5 to 10 years instead of life. And you'll have the comfort of knowing you didn't kill anyone." Frank looked at the pen. He looked at Cecilia. He realized, finally, that the mouse was gone. The woman standing before him was a titan, forged in the fire of his betrayal. He picked up the pen. His hand shook, but he signed. "Good choice," Cecilia said, taking the document. She turned to leave. "Cecilia," Frank called out, his voice small. She paused at the door. "What? Did you ever really love me?" Cecilia didn't look back. "I loved the man I thought you were. But that man never existed." She knocked on the metal door. "Guard, we're done here." As the heavy door slammed shut behind her, leaving Frank alone in the silence, he realized the hardest karma wasn't the prison cell. It was the knowledge that he had held a diamond in his hand, mistook it for glass, and threw it away. Outside the jail, Evelyn St. James was waiting in the back of the town car. As Cecilia slid in, Evelyn handed her a glass of sparkling water. "Did he sign?" Evelyn asked. "He signed," Cecilia said, staring out the window at the grey prison walls. "Apex is finished. And Frank? Frank is exactly where he belongs," Cecilia said. She took a sip of water, her hand steady. "Now let's go. We have a skyscraper to build." 6 months later, courtroom 4B looked exactly the same as it had on the day Frank Hall's life ended. The wood paneling was still polished to a high sheen. The air conditioning still hummed with a headache, inducing frequency, and Judge Holloway still sat high on the bench, peering over her spectacles. But everything else had changed. This time, Frank didn't walk in with an Italian suit and a smirk. He was shuffled in, his ankles shackled, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost 30 pounds. His hair, once perfectly styled with expensive gel, was thinning and grey. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like exactly what he was, inmate 8940. The gallery, which had been empty during his divorce hearing, was now packed. Reporters, former employees, and curious onlookers filled every bench. They weren't there to admire him. They were there to watch the final collapse of the architect of fraud. Frank scanned the room desperately. He wasn't looking for a friendly face. He knew he had none left. He was looking for her. And there she was. Cecilia sat in the front row. She looked radiant. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power and elegance. Her hair was cut in a sharp, modern bob. Next to her sat Evelyn St. James, looking smug in a mink stole, and Julian Thorne, checking his watch with the air of a man who had already won. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Holloway didn't waste time. She looked at Frank with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mr. Hall, you have pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. Under the terms of your plea agreement, the terrorism charges were dropped in exchange for your testimony against Victor Cray and Apex Designs." Frank nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor. However," the judge continued, her voice hardening, "your cooperation does not absolve you of the damage you caused. You betrayed your fiduciary duty. You betrayed your wife. And you nearly caused a catastrophic structural failure in a downtown skyscraper." I'm sorry," Frank whispered. "I'm sure you are," Judge Holloway said dryly. "But before I pass sentence, the prosecution has called a character witness to speak to your state of mind during these crimes." Frank frowned. Character witness? He hadn't called anyone. The side door opened. Frank's heart stopped. Jessica Vance walked in, but she wasn't the terrified girl who had run away outside the courthouse. She was dressed modestly in a grey cardigan and slacks, looking like a librarian. She walked to the stand, avoiding Frank's gaze entirely. "Miss Vance," the prosecutor asked, "please describe your relationship with Mr. Hall." Jessica took a deep breath. She looked at the jury box, though there was no jury for sentencing, tears welling in her eyes. "I was his victim," she sobbed. Frank gasped. "What?" "Order," the judge snapped. He manipulated me," Jessica continued, her voice trembling theatrically. "I was just 22. He told me he was separated. He told me he was a billionaire. He forced me to accept those gifts. He said if I didn't take the condo, he'd fire me. I was terrified of him." "Liar!" Frank screamed, struggling against his cuffs. "You begged for that condo. You chose the color of the granite. Mr. Hall, silence." Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Jessica wiped her eyes, sneaking a quick, triumphant glance at the cameras. She had cut a deal. Immunity in exchange for painting Frank as the sole mastermind. She was throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. "He was a monster," Jessica finished, sniffling. "He used everyone. I just want to move on and heal." She stepped down, walking past Frank. For a split second, their eyes met. Frank saw no remorse. He saw only the cold, hard calculation of a survivor. She had learned from the best, him. "Mr. Hall," Judge Holloway said, drawing his attention back to the bench. "Stand up." Frank stood, his legs shaking. "Frank Hall, for your crimes against the state and the victims of your fraud, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal correctional facility. You will also be required to pay restitution in the amount of $4 million to St. James and Terry Architects." 15 years. The number echoed in Frank's head. He would be 60 when he got out. His life was over. "Take him away," the judge ordered. As the bailiff grabbed his arm, Frank turned back to the gallery. He needed Cecilia to look at him. He needed her to see his pain. Maybe, just maybe, she would feel something. Anger. Pity. Anything was better than being invisible. "Cecilia!" he shouted over the noise of the courtroom. "Cecilia!" Cecilia stood up. She gathered her purse. She turned to Julian Thorne and said something that made him laugh. Then she turned to her mother and helped her with her wheelchair. She didn't look at Frank. Not once. She didn't even acknowledge he was in the room. She simply turned her back and walked toward the exit, her white suit shining like a beacon of his failure. "Cecilia, look at me," Frank begged as they dragged him toward the side door. "I made you. You were nothing without me." At the door, Cecilia finally paused. She didn't turn around. She just adjusted her coat, checked her phone, and walked out into the sunlight. Frank was shoved through the door into the darkness of the holding cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the light, the noise, and the last glimpse of the wife he had mocked. He was alone. Truly. Finally alone. And in the silence of his cell, Frank Hall realized the ultimate truth. Cecilia hadn't needed a lawyer to beat him. She just needed him to be himself. And that is the story of Frank Hall and Cecilia Terry. It's a brutal reminder that when you build a life on the foundation of arrogance and deceit, it only takes one person with the truth to bring the whole house down. Frank thought silence was weakness, but he learned too late that the quietest people often hold the loudest ammunition. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, karma, and sweet revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done if you were Cecilia? Would you have visited him in prison, or was erasing him completely the ultimate revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, remember, Be careful who you step on while climbing the ladder, because you never know who's holding it steady at the bottom.